Well, thank you everyone for joining me. My name is Ryan Kita. I work for Sony Pictures Entertainment. Today I want to talk about our solution that we had for rapid recovery in a business continuity situation. I know business continuity is probably usually about as dry as a mouthful of saltine crackers. I promise my goal will not to make that this kind of presentation. Really what I want to talk about is how we leveraged AWS, Amazon WorkSpaces, and Aspera software to kind of meet a very near-term and rapid need that we had to recover from a business continuity event. We'll talk about infrastructure, we'll talk about architecture, we'll talk about the benefits and some of our lessons learned. And hopefully if I manage to do this right and not babble along too much, we'll have some time at the end for questions. So a quick introduction about myself. I've spent a lot of time in digital media over the past decade or so, really worried about large on-premise infrastructure, dealing with large file transfer. And early on, was a big fan of AWS and what was going on in the cloud, really since 2007 or so. But the challenges that we had were the files just were too big, and some of the bandwidth that we need to accomplish just wasn't practical. These were the days of 5 gigabyte file limits within S3, and so it wasn't really practical for us to use it much. But much more recently, we've started to do a lot of hard work in the cloud. So starting about 2013, the technology kind of matured, the various platforms and instance sizes, and some of the other techniques and technologies, Direct Connect, has made it possible for us to move a lot of our media workflows. So we've gained a lot of experience in leveraging AWS, and it kind of prepared us for what we ran into next. So if I can set the stage of the story here, in the beginning, peace in the kingdom, everything's great. We have a large on-premise infrastructure, it's running well, lots of machines, multiple sites, people accessing that environment from our own network, from around the world. We have vendors, we have suppliers, everything's kind of rolling along well, moving files around the world, documents, our content, and we had lots of happy people. I promise these are happy people. They look like faceless zombies, the limitations of the icon art, but these were really happy people. Things were going well. I'm sure you've all done your business continuity planning. Again, a thrilling exercise of watching paint dry and talking about scenarios. And you're talking about what's available, what are your options. You're trying to do a risk-based approach. Okay, what are we going to have in multiple data centers, multiple sites, redundancy, high availability, what are the associated costs around coming up with that business continuity planning. We were no different. We worried about people not having access to facilities. We worried a lot about redundancy, again, multiple data centers. What are the critical apps that need to have multi-site protection? How are we going to make that work? How are we going to make that effective? And you do that approach, and again, you do your risk-based evaluation. Sometimes there are things that kind of fall outside of the planning that you can do. Famous quote, I love this one from the Monty Python boys. The follow-up line that actually comes right after that is actually equally great. So sometimes you're stuck in these business continuity situations, and it's not like they plan. You don't get an email the day before or early in the morning. Oh, by the way, we're going to lose all connectivity and a whole bunch of servers and infrastructure. So plan for that. So you pretty much wake up to a whole bunch of fun, and you're going to have to react pretty quickly to address those situations. And that could be bugs, virus, termites. It could be a giant anvil falling out of the sky on a city. It could be the zombie apocalypse. It could be any number of these things that are going to sort of throw a giant monkey wrench in your day and impact your ability to do business. And so from our perspective, sometimes those situations knock all your BCP planning out the window. And how are you going to kind of go from 0 to 100 and make something happen? And there's not a whole lot of time. Well, you spend a little bit of time panicking, but there's not that much time to panic. You have to kind of move on from those panic moments and figure out, okay, what are we going to do to address this situation? How are we going to move quickly from dealing with the inventory of what's not working to kind of coming up with a real solution to handle this? And so for us, that started with, okay, what were going to be the applicable workflows that we could move to the cloud? What were the things that we could solve very quickly to get things up and flowing again? And the easiest one for that was going to be digital file transfer and improving the global access for that file transfer right away. Again, we're a media company, so if I can't move our media around the world, that's a massive challenge. And so we had to get that up and going right away. And it's not like our entire media supply chain was impacted, but certainly a certain section of it was. And we need to get that up and going pretty quick. And then we had to handle secure access, right? So when you're losing part of your infrastructure, it's not just the people on hand. You need to figure out how you're going to get that up and running, but it's all your partners and suppliers. So people that you don't necessarily want to get hand keys to the kingdom for, but you need to figure out how you're going to get people into your infrastructure and deal with these challenges. You need those experts, and you need them right away. So again, we had a lot of prior experience with AWS that helped. We'd run 1 million proof of concepts with various parts of the infrastructure. We're actually building our next generation digital asset management system in the cloud. We've got about 1.8 petabytes of data in Glacier. Right now, we've got well over 300 terabytes active in S3. And we've been using a lot of these building block services to build applications around the networking, compute, a lot of the different storage types, and of course, the messaging protocols. So that kind of set us up well for when we want to go and handle and break off the secure transfer issue. So again, looking at the problem in the morning, we were saying, okay, there's a chance. We need to figure out a way to get this going. So realistically speaking, AWS was the only option to get this going. If we're going to figure out a way to get this into a colo facility, if we're going to order new hardware, if we're going to order new storage, none of those were going to be fast enough. The only option we had to get back in business quickly was going to be leveraging AWS. We had a lot of existing experience, as I've mentioned already before. We could leverage Aspera on demand, leverage your partners. So we placed a couple of important panicked phone calls and emails to get the necessary support we were going to need to put that together. And we mobilized a team to kind of get this done. And so we kind of started working on this. And honestly, this is not sort of a pitch. We really just in a full set of hours, basically from planning in the morning to executing in the afternoon, we had the entire basic file transfer infrastructure up and running to get business going just a matter of hours. And that was a pretty magical thing that we were able to pull off there. So what's in the box? What did we actually use to make this happen? So a lot of this is, again, sending and receiving digital packages of data. These could be very small files. This could be hundreds of gigabytes worth of files. So we needed something that could send and receive. We need suppliers to bring data back in. So we leveraged Aspera Faspx to get that basic function running again. What's great about it is it's entirely web-based. So we don't have to go and deploy a bunch of things to endpoints. We could use this mostly through the browser, though we did have a desktop option if needed. And it allowed us to sort of administer and control at a very granular level who we're inviting into this business continuity environment to get things back up and running. So that was sort of part of the problem. We need to solve this sending and receiving of digital packages. But that's not how the entire business runs. Some of the business runs sort of in more of a file-based metaphor. So we also needed to deal with people who wanted sort of file systems and file sharing. So that's really where Aspera Shares came into play. So we needed a way to virtualize the sort of the nodes of what you would expect in a file transfer scenario. And that has a lot of ability for us to virtualize both the cloud situation with S3 as well as on-premise locations as well. And all of that's virtualized through a web console that we can use, again, with very granular control of how we meter out access to those various locations and storage areas and move content around. Obviously, if you're going to deploy this architecture and manage hundreds of connections and the file movement, you need to control that. So we're leveraging Aspera console to do that. It centralized all of our management, real-time dashboards to see where things were going, see traffic patterns and issues, and of course, control those file transfers, the priority. Again, certain transfers are going to be more important than others in this scenario. We need to be able to dial that up and back, throttle back connections, and have control over that infrastructure. So from an OS perspective, we ran this all on Red Hat. Really, Linux is pretty important in this scenario. You really got to get the OS out of the overhead in those transfers, and so that was the OS of choice for us. What do we leverage from an AWS perspective for the platform? We're talking about leveraging Route 53 for all our DNS and service routing. Come on now. From a compute perspective, we leveraged EC2 in two major ways. So the Aspera tools have a web server front to kind of run the application, and the web front that we showed some screenshots of earlier. That was just on the M1 XLs, and that was fine. But for transfer, for moving large amounts of data, that wasn't nearly good enough. So for file transfer infrastructure, we ended up moving all the way up to C38XLs. And that was critical because of the enhanced networking and the throughput capability. So I'll talk about that a lot in a second, but that was critical to success for us to be able to scale that infrastructure. On the storage side, we were actually able to almost entirely use S3, which I think for me is a massive step forward. To be able to get enough parallel capacity to transfer data in and out at high rates, massive storage volumes was key, and we could entirely use S3. At low cost, it made the overall solution really affordable for business continuity. We did use a little bit of EBS to do the sync functionality. The Aspera product still needs sort of that file transfer mounted file system sort of attachment, and so we leveraged EBS in a very limited way. On the app services side of the house, we used SCS for email. Of course, if you're receiving or sending packages, you need to know that they're there for you, and you need to come up and pick it up, or any other alerts or administration overhead. So that was a big part there. And so what all of that allowed us to do is start small and then add on demand, right? So you started with a single instance, with a single S3 bucket to get the basic application up and rolling. And you don't know if this is going to be a business continuity event that's an hour, is this a day, is this a week, is this a month? So you don't want to have to start out and build this massive infrastructure if you just go and turn it off later on that day or later on that week. So we started with exactly what we thought we needed right out the gates, and then we were able to scale that over time. But as I mentioned, the C3s became really important because there's a lot of limitations and a lot of differences in the cloud infrastructure and how communication works than you get on your on-premises situation. So the C3 8XLs, again, as I mentioned, have a massive networking backplane. So the traditional XLs, we could only get about 0.8 gigabits per second out of the back of those for aggregate data transfer in and out of the cloud. And that wasn't cutting it. That wasn't good enough. So with the C3s, we could move at least 1.5. And we have some great graphs on this later, but that was able to spike up well over 2 gigabits per second on your transfer rates. The other interesting thing is you're buffering in, especially leveraging UDP and bringing all that data into the cloud really quickly. It's got to transform that data and use sort of TCP and HTTP to get that data written out to S3. And so that buffering of memory, even for the amount of memory on those 3 boxes, really limits the amount of sessions. So in an on-prem situation, you can easily get 5 times the number of transfer sessions than you can get on a comparable box within Amazon. So that's a limitation based on sort of the advantages. But it's worthwhile, in my perspective, to go that route because of the efficiency and the cost benefits you get out of the S3 platform. So it was a great multi-purpose tool for us. Again, we have to solve a whole magnitude of problems and getting the business going. As a studio, content is our lifeblood. So getting that moving again, across the various suppliers that we need to move content to was a huge deal. We also have to worry about supporting productions, right? We shoot content all around the world. They're creating things. They need to synchronize content off their remote locations and the various places to bring them back for editing. And that was where the Shares product played a huge role. Again, they're used to interacting with file systems, giving them this virtual file system world, and securely being able to manage that traffic was huge. Other things kind of fell out of the woodworks. Obviously, when you're dealing with a continuity event, you might need to ship new software images for your desktops or your server around the world. And these can be very, very big packages of data, and you need to be able to move that efficiently, potentially over weak WAN links to the various locations. So we use that quite a bit. We have to also move software all to these various locations, and of course, basic documents and securely transporting those around as well. So it started small, but we were able to use it, for pretty much every use case. It became a critical part of the recovery scenario. So let's talk through, architecturally where we ended with the final deployment. So I've mentioned already Route 53. We use that for DNS. From the web servers, for each of the products had their own dedicated web server running the M1XLs. On the back end, let's talk with Faspx first. To handle the capacity, we ended up landing on 2 C3 8XLs to handle the aggregate traffic and to be able to manage all that data with its own dedicated bucket. On the EC2 side, for shares, we had a single node on that end. We had the EBS, as I discussed, Console Web UI to manage the whole thing, and then to do our SMTP gateway messaging, we used SES. So that kind of was the infrastructure we landed on, and that was powering our entire back end. And so what were we doing? So in a sort of an average or a large month, we're moving about 76 terabytes of data in, moving about 80 terabytes of data out. And from an S3 perspective, that represented 160 terabyte months of data. And again, this is pretty extraordinary. There was no procurement wait time. There was no sort of, do I have space in my rack? Do I have open ports? All of this thing was turn it on and dial it up as we needed it. In and out of S3, I thought some interesting and fun numbers. 278 million puts, 658 million gets against the infrastructure. And again, being able to manage that 1.5 gigabit per second per EC2 instance was huge. And being able to get from a single stream perspective, that's an aggregate data number, single stream well above 700 megabits per second, assuming both ends could handle the speed, was terrific. So here's some data over time. So starting small as we rolled up the service and got cut over more workflows we needed for continuity, peaking up in February with almost 160 terabytes moved in and out of this continuity solution, and then ramping that down over time as the on-premise solution starts taking and offloading those workflows. Just for a single node, this shows individual transfers, and we get an effective rate well over 700 megabits per second. This is real data. Thank you, Michelle and Aspera, for helping me with these graphs. But this shows actual data out of one of the nodes in May. Again, real data for the total node performance. And so this is aggregate traffic. Again, you can see up in the front left-hand side of that graph, sustaining well over 1.9 gigabits per second through that time frame, and then spiking over 2.3. This is sort of, now that we've had sort of both situations back online, on-prem and in the cloud, through September, we're still getting tremendous utilization and balancing the load nicely across those three nodes, all of them able to hold a significant amount of throughput. This is kind of a cool graph about geographic spread. So again, all of our businesses at this point are global. And so it's not just good enough to move things from point to point. You have to be able to manage this across the entire world. And so whether it was numerous sites around the US, down to Latin America, Asia, several locations in Europe, you need to be able to manage and have that. And of course, that's pretty unique from a cloud perspective, being able to give you that spread and that ability. And across the top, not just the geographical locations, but each of those bars represented a discrete transfer, and the length of that bar represents the data moved in that transfer. Oh, jumped a little far there. And so this is an interesting graph that kind of represents the different types of content, and the size of the pie, if you will, represents the total number of files. So as a studio, we're pushing tons of video, so QuickTime Wrapped, not a lot of files, but certainly represents for about a half month's worth of data, about 1.8 terabytes of QuickTime Wrapped video. You're moving a lot of audio files to our various vendors for either dubbing or playout. We're moving a lot of images, that represents our artwork that goes along with our content, and then other, which actually ended up being a massive piece of the pie in terms of total number of files that we had to move, and that was almost 5,000 files and represented over 200 gigabytes of traffic. So benefits. Again, being able to kind of just plug this in and turn this on was a huge benefit for us. Again, starting in the morning, having sort of none of that infrastructure in place and having something up and running within that day's time was pretty tremendous. It was a huge win for us also to be able to scale this over time. Again, no one ever gives you the schedule of exactly how long your business continuity event's going to last. You're going to have to figure that out on your own. And so, being able to grow that over time and, of course, now wind that down is going to be a big benefit for us. Enabling business process, getting the business back up and running. Obviously, they don't really care that you're in the middle of a business continuity event. They just need their business up and running quickly, and being able to provide that seamlessly to them was a big deal. And of course, being able to mobilize a lot of this IT data that actually we didn't set out in the beginning, but a lot of that work finds you once you have a great solution up and running was a big benefit to the company. From for all these learnings and what would we do, how would we think about this in the future, I think there is a much more resilient future that we can plan forward from this. So some of the challenges, though, and lessons learned is when we did this initially, it was very manual. Manual configs, manual startup. You have to take the cluster down to add capacity. So that was sort of a limited sense of reality. We need a much more dynamic way to do that. And so as we move from the current model where we have sort of a hot sort of business continuity system up, we're moving towards warm and eventually something I'll roughly call lukewarm, where we want something available for us there in the cloud. We need something that's going to be a lot more dynamic. And so, really what we're looking for, and we're going to be working with Aspera on, is their new files product. So that allows us to just set up a cloud management console and then dynamically add transfer nodes and transfer infrastructure over time. So that whether it's overflow capability that we need or another business continuity event, we have that at our fingertips, and we don't have to go through the headache of lifting one of those up and putting it together again. So I'm going to move now and talk about our WorkSpaces VDI solution. So WorkSpaces, this was one of those things where I don't think we had this directly in our toolbox. We weren't planning on necessarily leveraging this, but it became a really important tool in our toolbox. And so, one of the key challenges that we ran into, which is what happens when you can't entirely trust all of the endpoints that need to interact with your infrastructure. How are you going to get access and secure access into your environment, deep into your environment for these endpoints? So, we all have enterprise management systems. We can manage our own enterprise endpoints. We certainly have that at Sony. But what happens when you need to bring a lot of third-party people into the environment? You got to manage as much as you can, but you have to be realistic about that. And then to cope for that, our solution was let's limit that surface area to the endpoint. What's the minimum amount of access? And we accomplished that through VDI, and making VDI the pane of glass that we brought people in through. Right? And we found a million uses for this in terms of bringing people in. The first I've already mentioned, which is vendor access. Right? So you need those experts. You need them right away to get into your environment. You don't want to wait for them to jump on a plane in some situations. You sure as heck don't want to give them a VPN credential. You don't know what's on that laptop. You don't know where they're going to come in from necessarily. You need a way to kind of bring them in a very secure manner. So that was a big usage. You're going to have your own development teams to get access to that server environment. Potentially you might need to leverage that and all the different various software configurations they might need. You might need to bring in users as you restore a set of systems to test and validate that system before you bring it out to the rest of the world. You don't want to put that out on your network yet, but you need to get these users in through that back channel and find an access. Personally, if I need to get in, maybe I'm working from home. Again, VPN's not a great option for me because, again, I know what I'm doing on my computer, but who knows what my wife and my daughters are doing on the computer, and who knows what they've downloaded on there. So I sure as heck don't want to VPN that directly into my infrastructure. And so by setting up these monthly workspaces, we could leverage that amortized pricing and be able to launch that and bring that in as a solution. So, what's in the box here? What do we leverage? Identity access management is a huge part of that, right? So whether you're talking about locking down the features and functions that you're opening up, whether you're talking about the credentials, that's a big part and a big start to this. This has to be very, very secure. And basic authentication wasn't going to be good enough. So we needed to enable two-factor or multi-factor authentication to bring people in. You couldn't survive any compromised credentials, someone posting a username and password out somewhere. You needed that second factor. And so plugging that into IAM was a big part of what we did. From a desktop software perspective, you are talking about launching desktops, so you need to kind of have a good hardened image. And you can start with one, but what we found is you ended up with many. And so you need a good strategy around managing these different images for the different types of users you're bringing in and what you're going to allow them to actually do. You have your typical management software and agents. You need to keep that thing patched. You need to manage the antivirus and anti-malware. And again, tons of optional software based on the nature of the developers or other clients that you're bringing in. From a platform perspective, we used Amazon WorkSpaces. And we actually leverage the fact that there's a geographic diversity to Amazon WorkSpaces, right? So again, as a global company, you have people who are potentially coming in from India, Europe, US, Asia, and so you're going to need a way to kind of bring them in. So we actually had 2 different sites running with Amazon WorkSpaces to reduce the latency. Because as we all know, sort of that VDI and workspace situation is very sensitive to latency. So we needed to account for that. And then also we leveraged Direct Connect wherever possible to backhaul all that IP traffic back into our data centers, again, to reduce the latency involved in people using this solution. So from a deployment perspective, we started with the various actors who might be coming into our system on whatever endpoint that they were coming in with. We brought that traffic in either through direct connect based on if they're in a particular location or over the internet. We leveraged IAM to securely allow them to access that environment. And then we had the two different workspaces that have their own associated VPCs. And this is something that we actually grew over time as well. So again, you're bringing different types of people into the environment. Obviously, you're going to direct connect them in and drop them into a firewall, but you need different zones. But again, you don't want to give sort of one-size-fits-all access across your environment. So we actually ended up breaking that up into different IP ranges and then allowing people into just certain segments of that back-end network based on their end access. And VPCs, and then of course what you can do on your own firewall really allows you to get a very granular approach on controlling that access. All right, so from a benefits perspective, again, you're trying to keep a locked vault on everything that you have and just find that minimum amount of surface area that you can expose. You need to bring people in. There's no way around that. You're not going to fly everyone into the data center. Even that has its own set of vulnerabilities. So you need to kind of create that access model where you're getting them the right level of access. We were able to spin up over 400 workspace images for people to be able to work and get things done in a very quick manner and dial those up and dial that down as we needed. And again, we were able to kind of fulfill a whole bunch of different needs and different classes of desktops and access that people had. So lessons learned for us, it's really easy to get going. It's really hard to make this sustainable. So you have to think ahead, think about process, right? The compliance folks are going to be out there. It's not just spinning these things up. When are you spinning them down? Who's using them? Are they using them? You need to think about how you're doing your management and maintenance of all these workstations that you're spinning up. And so again, it's a great and fun technology, but it can get out of hand if you're not thinking through the process and setting that up well. From a technology perspective, you have to plug this into your desktop management infrastructure or think about how you're going to handle that if for some reason your desktop management infrastructure is not in place. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you got to think about the health of those desktops. You got to think about patching. There's critical patches that are going to drop at least every week. So you need to think about how you're rolling those out and keeping those workstation images alive and breathing and well, and not just aging and becoming their own source of vulnerability for you. And then, of course, you got to think about antivirus and anti-malware capabilities as well to keep those protected and safe. So sort of wrapping up, there's a number of things that I think we learned. Obviously, is Amazon provides a great opportunity from a dynamic business continuity planning resource. It really gives you something out there that you can really use to kind of hedge against other things that you would not normally do. So maybe it's not practical for you to have an entire hot site for VDI or for your file transfer infrastructure, but maybe there is a way where you can leverage AWS to kind of have this lukewarm to cold site available to turn that up in a business continuity event. And that becomes a very cost-effective way to handle those scenarios that you couldn't justify cost-wise in your risk model. Oh, anytime now. Large file data transfer, huge maturity in that space and allowed us to kind of fulfill those workflows and move data globally around the world very effectively, very efficiently. Other uses aren't always obvious, right? So keep an open mind. The toolbox is vast. It's getting vaster by the day. The last two keynotes, there's at least a dozen new products out there. WorkSpaces was a great example of that. That was a bit of creativity on our part to address a certain business continuity need and to find that, hey, here's this product. If we connect it in this way, if we manage it that particular way, it turns into a really effective secure access solution. And then last but not least, it's really easy to move quickly in AWS. Everyone knows that scenario. I get a credit card and I could have as many servers as I want tomorrow, but it's really hard to plan ahead and make that manageable. So, obviously, if you're going to use this, I would encourage you to factor it into your approach, figure out the management aspects, figure out how you're going to roll it up and roll it down and manage it. But it can still be a very nimble solution for you, but plan ahead will make a big difference.